Hey, everybody, tune in to Recent Tartarians.
Recent Tartarians. Recent Tartarians.
Now that its formerly alien ambience has become native, and its once futurist technology has become contemporary, and even aboriginal, a new compromise would need to seem as foreign as the original Matrix did in the 90s. Wizard of Oz might quickly displace Matrix in the public imagination, as Kansas becomes harder to visualize than Mars. Imagine how foreign the jungles seem to drafted suburban American boys in Vietnam. The ultimate collage of environment and storytelling requires the audience to witness, as voyeur, a metaphysical space, as if for the first time. In our generation, no work has done so as commandingly as George Lucas's Star Wars. When George Lucas sat down in early 1973 to draft an operatic science fiction movie about a ragtag group of rebels fighting a corrupt central government, the trial of the Watergate burglars had just begun. There are some esoteric symbols littered through Star Wars, and audacious analogies and innuendos, while the elite Jedi, who guard peace and justice in the Galactic Republic, bear similarities to Japanese samurai and Shaolin monks. They also echo the medieval monastic military order of the Knights Templar. The Templars, writes Terrence McMullen in Star Wars and History, were esteemed above other knights for their austerity, devotion, and moral purity. Like the Jedi, the Templars practiced individual poverty within a military monastic order that commanded great material resources. A 12-member council of elders headed by a Grand Master governed both the Jedi and the Templars, and Jedi clothing even resembled the hooded white robes worn by the Christian warrior monks who took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, much like the Great Jedi Purge ordered by Chancellor Palpatine in Revenge of the Sith. France's King Philip IV annihilated the Knights Templar after arresting hundreds of them on October 13th, 1307, and subsequently torturing and executing them for heresy. It is clear that the Jedi believe they are righteous, but are they? It seems like rebels, not Jedi, are the heroes of the galaxy. Lucas is on record having said that the original Star Wars was in part a commentary on the globalist military-industrial complex, the problems in the Middle East, and in part the Vietnam conflict. In an interview, George Lucas once said in an interview it was really about the Vietnam War, and that was the period where Nixon was trying to run for a term, which got me to thinking historically about how do democracies get turned into dictatorships, because the democracies aren't overthrown, they're given away. George Lucas was fascinated by the Far East. He studied Buddhism and the Veda and greatly admired Thich Nhat Hanh, a Vietnamese Zen Buddhist monk who helped pioneer the concept of mindfulness in the West and socially engaged Buddhism in the East. In his book, The Dharma of Star Wars, Matthew Bordelin, a student of Thich Nhat Hanh, sorts through the film's spiritual themes and applies Buddhist teachings to George Lucas epics. He writes, in Star Wars, it is Luke Skywalker in the saga's final chapter that best exemplifies wisdom and compassion. In Return of the Jedi, Luke has developed these qualities of being better than any Jedi before him, even better than his master Obi-Wan. Read about Luke Skywalker's practice of wisdom. Luke's true Jedi mastery is demonstrated by the fact that he allows himself to be vulnerable to suffering. By doing so, he discovers an inner strength greater than that of any Jedi of his time, and even of the previous era of the Jedi ascendancy. After his confrontation with Darth Vader in The Empire Strikes Back, Luke knows good still remains in his father. Obi-Wan, however, cannot see this. He is attached to the view that Vader is more machine than man, twisted and evil. Obi-Wan fails to look deeply, to see past the vile acts of Vader and recognize the heart of a man who was suffering terribly. Luke does not make the same mistake. He saw that his father had forgotten himself, and needed to be offered understanding and compassion in order to be returned to the good side. In Return of the Jedi, Luke's wisdom and compassion propel him to turn himself over to the Empire, in order to rescue his father. He tells Leia, there is good in him, I felt it. He won't turn me over to the Emperor. I can save him. I can turn him back to the good side. I have to try. Luke allows himself to be made a prisoner of the Empire in order to save Vader, to draw his father out of suffering. Offering understanding and compassion, Luke appeals to the good Anakin that remained in the shadows of Darth Vader, reminding him of his life before he turned to evil. Luke says, "You were once Anakin Skywalker, my father." "That name," Vader replies, "no longer has any meaning for me. It is the name of your true self," Luke says. "You've only forgotten. I know there is good in you. The Emperor hasn't driven it from you fully." Then Luke directs his father back to himself, to look deeply into his own nature. "Search your feelings, Father. I feel the conflict within you. Let go of your hate." For it is Vader's attachment to hatred for himself, for his crimes, among other things, that perpetuates his suffering. It's important we see in this that even Luke Skywalker, with his great mastery of the Jedi ways, of understanding and compassion, cannot with his own power turn Vader away from the path of the dark side. This is always the case. We can only offer others compassionate support and wise advice, but only they themselves can remove the shroud of ignorance from their heart and mind. Luke does not tell Vader what he should or should not do. He simply directs Vader back to himself, to search his own feelings, to investigate his own mind and discover the truth that it is not too late for him, that he can still lift himself out of the dark side. This is the Jedi way, and it is also the Dharma way. This is also the way of the Tao. Chaos before order, before chaos, before order. In 1973, George Lucas said Star Wars was about a large technological empire going after a small group of freedom fighters. In a way, Star Wars was the first political meme of the modern era. The political history of Star Wars began hopefully enough with Jimmy Carter, like Luke Skywalker, a farm boy who went on to bigger things, watching episode IV, A New Hope at Camp David in 1978 with Egyptian President Anwar Sadat, as they held a secret strategy session for the historic Camp David Accords. But the real breakthrough came in 1983, the same year as Return of the Jedi. President Reagan had been lobbing rhetorical attacks at the Soviet Union throughout his first term, but he'd faced pushback from the more establishment foreign policy types in the White House. One speech at the British House of Commons in particular had been watered down. The White House's conservatives struck back, taking some of the harsher lines from that speech, and adding new jabs to one set to be delivered before the National Association of Evangelicals, an address that the foreign policy gurus would overlook. One section of the speech ended up defining Reagan's combative approach to the USSR. "I urge you to beware the temptation of pride, the temptation of blithely declaring yourselves above it all, and label both sides equally at fault, to ignore the facts of history and the aggressive impulses of an evil empire, to simply call the arms race a giant misunderstanding, and thereby remove yourself from the struggle between right and wrong and good and evil," he said. Speechwriter Anthony R. Dolan, who wrote that paragraph, later denied that the term evil empire was inspired by the Galactic Empire in Star Wars, but the image stuck in large part because of that resonance. The Soviets decried the evil empire speech, as it came to be known, and Reagan himself walked the phrase back in a 1988 meeting with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, arguing it came from another time, another era, but the association was hard to shake, especially since Reagan was a former actor who was known to be influenced by watching movies. When he gave a second speech a few weeks later calling for a space-based missile defense system, critics dubbed it Star Wars, and the name stuck. By 1985, even a group supporting the Strategic Defense Initiative was using the name in its ads, leading to an unsuccessful lawsuit on trademark infringement from Lucasfilm Limited. It was telling that Lucas only tried to enforce his trademark when it was used to defend SDI. But the lawsuit was doomed because politics is so often thinly veiled plagiarism. You can't trademark a political argument, or sue to keep a metaphor in check, and so it proliferates. From the 1980s on, the congressional record is littered with references to Skywalkers and Yodas, Death Stars and Darth Vaders. Quotes from the movie are repeated and garbled, and analogies are stretched beyond all recognition. The alternative minimum tax. Sen Max Baucus once argued on the floor of the world's greatest deliberative body is like Anakin Skywalker. Both Skywalker and the Amp started off with great intentions, but eventually they went astray, he said. From Lucas' perspective, at least Baucus was acknowledging that Anakin Skywalker erred in becoming Darth Vader. Another strain of conservative thought beginning around the time of the prequels held that maybe the Empire wasn't so bad, after all. The argument first made a splash in 2002 in the conservative Weekly Standard, which argued as Attack of the Clones was hitting theaters that Emperor Palpatine was a dictator, but a relatively benign one, like Pinochet, and a dictatorship people can do business with. During the Bush administration, Vice President Dick Cheney was called Darth Vader by critics so often that he embraced the nickname, dressing up his black lab in a Vader costume for Halloween in 2007, and joking that it was one of the nicer things I've been called recently. Eventually, he began using the Imperial March, Vader's instantly recognizable theme, as his walk-up music in political appearances. Cheney was still mostly joking, but by 2015, conservative writers were regularly celebrating the Galactic Empire on Twitter. And in an interview shortly after the 2016 election with The Hollywood Reporter, Donald Trump's then advisor and Breitbart News executive Steve Bannon made clear he was not just making a contrarian joke. "Darkness is good," he said, arguing it helps distract political opponents. Dick Cheney, Darth Vader, Satan, that's power. It only helps us when they get it wrong, when they're blind to who we are and what we're doing. In our own history, the origins of the Ewoks can be found in the Vietnam War. In that confrontation during the Cold War, the guerrilla Viet Cong warriors were a constant threat to the anti-communist soldiers because they knew every inch of the jungles they called home. George Lucas has been quoted as saying he needed to come up with a primitive creature that was still using sticks and stones and spears, or weapons, and that lived in a primitive society that would be forced to take on the highly technological empire. Vietnam, it turns out, was a strong undercurrent in the thinking of Lucas. Even before he made Star Wars, he wanted to make a documentary-style anti-war film on Vietnam that was to be called, in a title devised by his friend John Milius, Apocalypse Now. Lucas saw Apocalypse, American Graffiti and Star Wars as a loosely linked thematic trilogy exploring the war in Southeast Asia, the Proletarian glory before it, and the fascistic empire ruled aftermath. The registration plate on Milner's yellow Deuce Coupe is THX 138 on a yellow California license plate. For American Graffiti, the setting is 2 months before the Cuban Missile Crisis, and before the outbreak of the Vietnam War, and the John F. Kennedy assassination, and before the peak years of the counterculture movement. The radio is a strong plot device throughout the film. Lucas enjoyed science fiction journals, and imagined the vast distances and periods of time it would take for radio to reach other worlds, and that any signal arriving on Earth would have had to be sent a long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away. American Graffiti evokes mankind's relationship with machines, notably the elaborate number of hot rods, having been called a classic car flick, representative of the motor car's importance to American culture at the time it was made. Another theme is teenagers' obsession with radio, especially with the inclusion of Wolfman Jack and his mysterious and mythological faceless voice. George Lucas's Star Wars, Episode II, Attack of the Clones features references to the film. The yellow airspeeder that Anakin Skywalker and Obi-Wan Kenobi used to pursue bounty hunter Zam Wesell is based on John Milner's yellow Deuce Coupe, while Dex's Diner is reminiscent of Mel's Drive-In. Star Wars uses the aesthetic of space to force the audience to analyze worldly functionality that might seem common otherwise. Star Wars is clearly a set of stories that are not primarily about futuristic and fictional space battles, but is about spiritual worlds and real-life witchcraft. It plays off of the witches and warlocks' own concept of light side and dark side, or that there is such a thing as white and black magic. In Kabbalistic and Hasidic philosophy, Seder Hestalshalos refers to the chain-like descent of spiritual worlds, Olam, Olamat, between God and creation. Each spiritual world denotes a complete realm of existence, resulting from its general proximity or distance to divine revelation. Each realm is also a form of consciousness reflected in this world through the psychology of the soul. First, everything Star Wars took from Dune. There are a number of striking similarities between George Lucas' much-loved Star Wars franchise and Frank Herbert's seminal 1965 novel, Dune, released in 1965. Dune has been recognized as one of the most significant and influential works in the entirety of science fiction, spawning several adaptations and pale imitations, with vibes of Islamic futurism which would later influence Pitch Black and the Chronicles of Riddick. Set on the desert planet of Arrakis, the saga centers around the mythical substance spice, a drug capable of imbuing enhanced consciousness and facilitating intergalactic travel. The story also incorporates elements of religion, politics, and philosophy, causing comparisons to everything from Game of Thrones to The Lord of the Rings. Tolkien incidentally hated Dune. Lord of the Rings offers us a crypto-religious, mystified, non-industrialized, low-tech world, where there is a clear dichotomy between good and evil. Convenient to choose between, and Frodo through personal sacrifice enables an intervention from without, thus giving an intensely moral tale. Dune offers us an anthropologically fox religious, highly military industrialized, high-tech world of secular Machiavellian politics and moral ambiguity. In a spiritually bereft world, Paul becomes a false prophet leading to mass anarchy and chaos, thus giving us an intensely visceral and visionary but disturbing tale. Without faith, humans have become in the extreme, a grotesque profanity of dependency. Considering this, Dune then just becomes a story of sex and violence, drugs and avarice, leading to a Muslim-inspired jihad. Small wonder the rather prudish, self-proclaimed pedant and devout Catholic, and morally reassured Tolkien hated it. Dune was intended to be made into a film by Jodorowsky. There is a fantastic documentary on the debacle which was eventually abandoned. Star Wars filled the role of Dune in science fiction, and surpassed Dune in film. Dune was later made into a film directed by David Lynch, and was ironically considered by then a cheap rip-off of Star Wars. Tragically, Star Wars is more than a rip-off of Dune. It's basically fan fiction, complete with giant worms. In Star Wars, there's the Empire, in Dune there's the Imperium. As the center of political power in the galaxy, if anything, the Imperium is arguably a slightly more morally ambiguous presence than the pedestrianly obvious evil Empire. The Sith Emperor is the villain in Star Wars, whereas the Padishar Emperor's clear ambition and aggression towards the novel's protagonist firmly places them in opposition in Dune. Princess Leia has clear and undoubted similarities between her character Leia and Dune's Aelia Atreides, the younger sibling of main protagonist Paul, which, in and of itself, suggests another Star Wars connection thanks to Luke and Leia's familial bond. Aelia is a mysterious character, blessed with preternatural insight and mind control abilities thanks to her exposure to the water of life. Similarly, Leia is not only a close relation of the main Star Wars protagonist Luke, but is also Force-sensitive, suggesting that the link between Leia and Aelia is more than just etymological. A worm, slug-like creature about 15 feet long with human-like facial features, arms, and hands, who sits on a dais. Sounds like Jabba the Hutt, but 2 years before Jabba appeared in Return of the Jedi. Frank Herbert debuted a character named Leto to Atreides with the exact same description in God Emperor of Dune. Lucas pretty much ripped the character straight out of Herbert's book and put him in his movie. In the new editions of the first Star Wars, a deleted scene with a human as Jabba is digitally replaced with a hybrid Jabba worm. In Dune, Leto was originally human, but later turned himself into a human sandworm hybrid. Darth Vader's revelation about Luke Skywalker's true parentage in The Empire Strikes Back is one of the most famous scenes in movie history. However, although the dramatic moment remains iconic, it perhaps wouldn't have existed at all without Dune. Much like the shocking reveal in Cloud City, it is explained halfway through Dune that Paul Atreides is actually the nephew of his sworn enemy, Baron Vladimir Harkonnen. Although it is not Vladimir himself who divulges this information, the role of heritage for both Paul and Dune and Luke in Star Wars highlights how the two stories remain closely connected. Star Wars has the Jedi, Dune has the Bene Gesserit. The Jedi Order is revealed to sit adjacent to politics, offering counsel to political leaders while subtly influencing affairs from the sidelines. Similarly, the world of Dune is shepherded by the Bene Gesserit cult, a matriarchal group manipulating events behind the scenes and often accused of witchcraft. Much like the Jedi, Bene Gesserit members can be found throughout the galaxy, highlighting their importance to the world of Dune. Though the all-female makeup of the Bene Gesserit differs from the Jedi Order, both groups' status as pseudo-religious organizations demonstrates another clear connection. One of the similarities is the ability to practice mind control. Certain characters in the story, such as Paul and his mother, the Lady Jessica, are capable of layering and intoning their voices in such a way as to be able to influence and control others. While this does not grant them the ability to move objects with their minds, it does bear a striking resemblance to Obi-Wan's ability to control the stormtroopers on Tatooine. One of the biggest links between the Bene Gesserit and the Jedi, beyond their spirituality, is both groups' quest for a so-called Chosen One. In the world of Star Wars, it is said that this figure will bring balance to the Force and cause the destruction of the Zen Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh, who helped pioneer the concept of mindfulness in the West and socially engaged Buddhism in the East's enemies, the Sith. By contrast, the Bene Gesserit believe that their Kwisatz Haderach will bring about the ascension of the human race, a process that the group attempts to initiate by means of genetic manipulation. Although there are differences, the presence of a messianic figure in both franchises is probably more than a mere coincidence. The Trade Federation, first introduced in Star Wars, the Phantom Menace has a monopoly on shipping in space, exactly like the Spacing Guild in the Dune series. Star Wars has stormtroopers, Dune has the Sardaukar, and that's about the gist of the differences between Star Wars and Dune. In fact, in the 2003 Herbert biography Dreamer of Dune, written by his son Brian, it is claimed that and the other science fiction writers who thought they saw their work in Lucas's movie formed a loose organization that my father called, with his tongue firmly placed in his cheek, the We're Too Big to Sue George Lucas Society. Both Star Wars and Dune feature guerrilla warbands fighting for freedom from the oppression of an imperialist incursion. However, while the Rebel Alliance owes a clear debt to Dune's Fremen, there are differences between the two. For instance, Star Wars rebels are drawn from all corners of the galaxy, whereas Dunes initially hail entirely from Arrakis. Nevertheless, the presence of freedom fighters in both works provides another unmistakable connection. One of the most important plot points in Dune is the so-called spice melting, a mind-altering substance that allows for interstellar travel, and that's only known source, at least in the first book, is the planet Arrakis. Possession of the spice influences everything in the world of Dune, and is one of the factors that shapes the Harkonnen, Atreides feud at the center of the narrative. In Star Wars, spice is actually a significant overall plot point. George Lucas films do feature spice mines on the planet Kessel, which are essential to the overall economy and medicine of the civilians and military across the galaxy. In fact, Han Solo's Kessel Run is a spice smuggling run. Perhaps the most obvious similarity between the two is the setting. Dune's defining feature is the harsh, arid environment of Arrakis, which boasts oceans of sand in place of actual water. By contrast, Tatooine seems to have a slightly more prosperous population and natural resources, but the physical and climatological similarities between the two planets are uncanny. Additionally, one of Tatooine's most famous characteristics is the twin suns that illuminate the horizon. While Arrakis only orbits a single star, it does have two prominent moons, which may have influenced Lucas' thinking about Tatooine. On Arrakis, devices known as dew collectors allow the inhabitants to harvest water, fulfilling almost exactly the same function, quite similar to George's The Moisture Evaporators. Living out on the rural sandflats of Tatooine, Owen Lars worked as a moisture farmer in the original Star Wars movie, ably assisted by his nephew, Luke Skywalker, and, for a limited period, the droids R2-D2 and C-3PO. In Dune, spice harvesters traverse Arrakis to mine and store spice melee. In A New Hope, sandcrawlers are from a forgotten mining era that Yawas converted to traverse Tatooine and pick up old droids and equipment. Both Dune and Star Wars boast an array of incredible and terrifying creatures. However, none are perhaps more iconic than Arrakis' gigantic sandworms, which can grow to several hundreds of meters long and are even used as a means of transportation by the planet's local Fremen people. Although there are no direct equivalents in the Star Wars universe, the sandworms do share some characteristics with the infamous Sarlacc pit from The Return of the Jedi. Although the Sarlacc's complete physiology is never fully revealed, the creature's sharp teeth bear a striking resemblance to those of the sandworms, from which the Fremen make their fabled Chris knives. To make the comparison even more concrete, the Sarlacc itself even lives in a region of Tatooine known as the Dune Sea. Aside from the obvious references to Dune, and Dune's clear Islamic imagery, there is clear perspective from a young man in the 70s through George Lucas' vision of American graffiti in space, Vietnam draftee stormtroopers on the Death Star, and the Israeli-Palestinian Gaza conflict for a Zionist homeland, and the conflict in preserving a Palestinian state. The heroes of the Star Wars series are members of a rebel alliance, basically Maccabees in outer space. The very symbol of Israel is indeed a star. In the earliest version of the initial draft for Star Wars, Solo was an alien of the Uralian race, eventually a disgraced prince turned space pirate, a wise figure, a captain, Solomon. According to Wikipedia, the House of Solo was a Corellian family that could trace its descent to Prince Admiral Jonish E. Solo. Baratheon E. Solo ruled the Corellian Empire during the Golden Age of the Old Republic, and introduced democratic reforms that ended the era of monarchy in the Corellian system. After Baratheon, the Solo line fell into obscurity and infamy, but some evidence suggests that famous founding hero of the New Republic Han Solo belonged to the house. King Solomon is one of the most prominent figures of history. He was the second son of King David, and Bathsheba, and appointed as ling at the young age of 12. Some historians claim that Solomon was actually the 17th of 19 sons of David, not the second. Therefore, his chances of succeeding his father as king were so less, it was indeed impossible. Some religions and scholars believe that Solomon disobeyed God during the last few years of his life. Mythologist Joseph Campbell said of Han Solo, "He thinks he's an egoist, but he really isn't. There's something else pushing Han." Han Solo's friend Chewbacca is like Enkidu the Wild Man in the Epic of Gilgamesh. I found a persuasive article by Indy Zoller arguing that the Epic of Gilgamesh should be Hollywood's next big movie, and I tend to agree. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, Enkidu is a wild man who lives in the forest with the wild animals. After a harlot convinces him to become civilized by having sex with him for a week, which would be key scene in this blockbuster, she introduces him to Gilgamesh, and the two manly men beat each other to a bloody pulp in the streets before becoming lifelong, inseparable best friends. The Gilgamesh-Enkidu friendship is one for the ages. They cut down giant trees and fight ancient monsters recreationally, not because the monsters are threatening the world, not because they need the trees sap for a magical potion to heal a princess, not because they're on a quest for redemption or nobility. It's just for the hell of it. After our modern-day Han Solo and Chewbacca finish becoming fast friends, Gilgamesh offends the goddess Ishtar by refusing to sleep with her, noting quite rightly that her lovers tend to end up suffering unfortunate fates. Scored, the goddess decides to unleash the Bull of Heaven on Gilgamesh's city. The heroes win, but the gods, angered at the death of the Bull of Heaven, and strike down Enkidu, Gilgamesh's life-debt furry Wookiee friend. And the only thing to do is to go to the ends of the earth and find the secret to eternal life. In a series of events far crazier than anything in the new Spider-Man movie, Gilgamesh braves scorpion men who guard the tunnel that the sun uses to reach the other side of the earth every night, and stays at an inn with an immortal survivor of the Great Flood, has to stay awake for 7 days, finds an immortality flower, and then loses it when a snake eats it after he stops to bathe. The upshot is, Gilgamesh comes to terms with his own mortality. Han Solo, the space Solomon, says he can do the Kessel Run in less than 12 parsecs. In Kabbalah there is a mystical tree of life which is illustrated so as to give place to the Sephirot, or Sephirot. Sephirot refers to the 10 enumerations, or attributes via which the infinite reveals himself, and the 11th from where he keeps creating the physical and ethereal realms. While all of this and more would require much definition, it is not all important to our bottom line, and so will be largely left undefined. The theosophical tradition in Kabbalah is concerned with defining in great detail the esoteric nature, particular divine manifestations, and functional role of each level between the infinite and the finite. Each spiritual realm embodies a creative stage God continually uses to go from his self to the creation of the physical world, the material universe being the end of the chain, and the only physical realm. Hasidic thought applies the Kabbalistic scheme to its own concern of perceiving divine omnipresence in this material world. In this, Hasidism varies in its use of Kabbalah, mainstream Hasidism avoiding Kabbalistic focus, while Chabad thought explains Seder Histauschalus in relation to man's psychology, in contrast to the functional aim of Kabbalah. This contemplates Seder Histauschalus as a vehicle for relating to the divine unity with creation. Counting up the 10 and 11 discs of a Sephirot, you will see they are slightly less than 11. According to the Prophet of Islam, Muhammad, the form of Allah is non-anthropomorphic, and God is not a personified deity. From this arabesque, the nature of reality are interpreted rather than just one's own life. Mainstream quantum physics ideas about the universe being created out of nothingness resembles those expressed in Kabbalah. The affinities between Stephen Hawking's brief history of time and with the Kabbalah are striking. In their book The Grand Design, Stephen Hawking and Leonard Vlodina argue that there was nothing before the beginning, and explain it by comparing the beginning to South Pole. They say there is nothing south of the South Pole, and there was nothing before the beginning. The similarity in the Kabbalistic idea that Hebrew letters were the material of which the universe was built, and Stephen Hawking's explanation why Albert Einstein's theory of relativity will break down at some point that he called the singularity. Although Hebrew letters have shapes, they are actually made out of nothing, as well as the singularity of the Big Bang. The singularity of black holes could be compared to Kabbalistic spheres of nothing. In an early Kabbalistic text, Rabbi Sefer Yetzirah wrote of cosmogenesis, "For that which is light is not darkness, and that which is darkness is not light." Sefirot, meaning emanations, are the 10 attributes, emanations in Kabbalah, through which Ein Sof reveals itself, and continuously creates both the physical realm and the chain of higher metaphysical realms. The names of the 10 Sephirot are Chokmah, wisdom; Bina, understanding; Dot, knowledge; Chest, kindness; Gevura, strength; Tiferet, beauty; Netzik, victory; Hod, splendor; Yesod, foundation; and Malchut, kingship. Everything that happens in the spiritual worlds takes place through the medium of the Sephirot. However, as previously mentioned, they are not GD, and the Kabbalists warn that one should not pray to them. In the words of Tikuni Zohar, Elijah opened his discourse and said, "Master of the worlds, you are one but not in the numerical sense. You are exalted above all the exalted ones, hidden from all the hidden ones. No thought can grasp you at all. You are he who has brought forth 10 garments. And we call them 10 Sephirot, and revealed worlds, and through them you conceal yourself from man. There are 3 inert Sephirot, which precede the 10. 0, Ein, nothing; 0, Ein Sof, limitlessness; 0, or Ein Sof, endless light, and the connection between them, the Simsum, or contraction, Ein, Hebrew meaning nothingness, is an important concept in Kabbalah and Hasidic philosophy. It is contrasted with the term Yesh, Hebrew something, exist, being, is. According to Kabbalistic teachings, before the universe was created there was only Ein, and the first manifest Sephirah, the divine emanation, Chokmah, wisdom, comes into being out of Ein. In this context, the Sefer Keter, the divine will, is the intermediary between the divine infinity, Ein Sof, and Chokmah, because Keter is a supreme revelation of the Ein Sof, transcending the manifest separate. It is sometimes excluded from them. Ein is closely associated with the Ein Sof, Hebrew meaning no end, without an end, which is understood as the deity prior to his self-manifestation and the creation of the spiritual and physical realms, single infinite unity beyond any description or limitation. From the perspective of the emanated created realms, creation takes place Yesh Mi Ein. From the divine perspective, creation takes place Ein Mi Yesh, as only God has absolute existence. Creation is dependent on the continuous flow of divine life force, without which it would revert to nothingness. Since the 13th century, Ein has been one of the most important words used in Kabbalistic texts. The symbolism associated with the word Ein was greatly emphasized by Moses de Leon c. 1250-1305, a Spanish rabbi and Kabbalist. Through the Zohar, the foundational work of Kabbalah, in Hasidism, Ein relates to the internal psychological experience of Dvaiket, and the contemplative perception of paradoxical Yesh Ein, divine panentheism. There is no place empty of him. In his Arabic language work Emunath V'Dioth, Sadia Gaon, a prominent 9th century rabbi and the first great Jewish philosopher, argues that the world came into existence out of nothingness. This thesis was first translated into Hebrew as Yesh Mi Ein, meaning something from nothing. In the 11th century, Jewish philosophers of the 9th and 10th century adopted the concept of Yesh Mi Ein, contradicting Greek philosophers, an Aristotelian view that the world was created out of primordial matter and or was eternal. Both Maimonides and the centuries earlier author of the Kabbalistic related work Sefer Yetzirah accepted the formulation of creation, Yesh Me'ayin. Chapter 2, Mishnah 6 of the latter includes the sentence, He made his ayin, Yesh. This statement, like most in Jewish religious texts, can be interpreted in different ways. For example, He made that which wasn't into that which is, or He turned his nothingness into something. Joseph ben Shalom Ashkenazi, who wrote a commentary on Sefer Yetzirah in the 14th century, and Azriel of Gerona, Azriel ben Nahum, one of the most important Kabbalists in the Catalan town of Gerona during the 13th century, interpreted the Mishnah as He made his ayin, Yesh's creation of Yesh Me'ayin. Maimonides and other Jewish philosophers argued a doctrine of negative theology, which says there are no words to describe what God is, and we can only describe what God is not. Kabbalah accepted this in relation to ayin, becoming one of the philosophical concepts underlying its significance. However, Kabbalah involves itself with the different, more radical proposition that God becomes known through His emanations of separate and spiritual realms, emanator and emanations comprising the two aspects of divinity. The force is the Ein Sof. Ein Sof, meaning infinite, literally without end, in Kabbalah, is understood as God prior to any self-manifestation in the production of any spiritual realm, probably derived from Solomon ibn Gabriel's c. 1021, c. 1070 term, the Endless One. Ein Sof may be translated as an ending, no end, or infinity. It was first used by Azriel c. 1160, c. 1238, who, sharing the Neoplatonic belief that God can have no desire, thought, word, or action, emphasized by it the negation of any attribute. Of the Ein Sof, nothing can be grasped. It is the origin of the Ein Sof, the infinite light of paradoxical divine self-knowledge, nullified within the Ein Sof prior to creation. In Lurianic Kabbalah, the first act of creation, the Tzimtzum self-withdrawal of God to create an empty space, takes place from there. In Hasidic Judaism, the Tzimtzum is only the illusionary concealment of the Ein Sof, giving rise to monistic panentheism. Consequently, Hasidism focuses on the Atzmos divine essence, rooted higher within the Godhead than the Ein Sof, which is limited to infinitude, and reflected in the essence of the Torah and the soul. The Zohar explains the term Ein Sof as follows. Before He gave any shape to the world, before He produced any form, He was alone, without form and without resemblance to anything else. Who then can comprehend how He was before the creation? Hence it is forbidden to lend Him any form, or similitude, or even to call Him by His sacred name, or to indicate Him by a single letter or a single point. But after He created the form of the heavenly man, He used him as a chariot wherein to descend, and He wishes to be called after His form, which is the sacred name YHWH. In other words, Ein Sof signifies the nameless being. In another passage, the Zohar reduces the term to Ein, because God so transcends human understanding as to be practically non-existent. In addition to the Sefer Yetzirah and the Zohar, other well-known explications of the relation between Ein Sof and all other realities and levels of reality have been formulated by the Jewish mystical thinkers of the Middle Ages, such as Isaac the Blind and Azriel. Judah Hayat, in his commentary Minhat Yehuda on the Merkat Elahut, gives the following explanation of the term Ein Sof. Any name of God which is found in the Bible cannot be applied to the deity prior to His self-manifestation in the creation, because the letters of those names were produced only after the emanation. Moreover, a name implies a limitation in its bearer, and this is impossible in connection with the Ein Sof. Ein Sof, the Attic Yeoman, emanates the Sephirot into the cosmic womb of the Ayin in a manner that results in the created universe. The three letters composing the word Ayin indicate the first three purely intellectual Sephirot, which precede any emotion or action. The spot on the tree in which the 10 Sephirot united as one is called Dot. Note that when transliteral in Hebrew the letter H is often employed even though it is generally silent in English. Examples are Torah, Kabbalah, etc. In Hebrew itself, the letter He was added to a name in order to illustrate its inspiration, literally the presence of the Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit, such as Abraham changing to Abraham, Sarai to Sarah, etc. Thus, Dot, which is already close to Darth, is also known as Doth or even Das, even though the last letter of the word is Tab. This appears to be accommodated to the Sephardic pronunciation versus the Ashkenazi one. That is to say, the Spaniard Jewish versus the European Jewish pronunciations, also detected in the difference between Shabbat versus Shavuos, Adonai versus Adonai, etc. Point being that while Doth is already close to Darth, Goth is even closer. The young Jedi Padawan has hair braids that reminds me of the Jewish tradition of Payet. As Kabbalistic teachings spread into Slavonic lands, the custom of Payet became accepted there. In 1845, the practice was banned in the Russian Empire. Crimean Karates did not wear Payet, and the Crimean Tatars consequently referred to them as Zulufs Kufitler, to distinguish them from the Krimchaks, referred to as Zulufli Kufitler. Many Hasidic and Timani Jews let their side locks grow particularly long. Even in some communities where Payet are not customary among the men, young boys may grow them until the age of bar mitzvah. Some people speculate that the word Jedi was inspired by the word Jewish, Yiddish, and Yoda came from Yehuda, etc. I prefer the ancient Egyptian origin of the word, i.e. that the pharaoh was required to raise in a special festival. The Jed is one of the more ancient and commonly found symbols in ancient Egyptian religion, and in hieroglyphs represent stability and balance of the creator god Ptah, and Osiris, the Egyptian god of the afterlife, the underworld, and the dead. It is commonly understood to represent Osiris' spine. Kabbalistically, the raising the body of Anakin Skywalker on the table of Palpatine at the end of the new trilogy signifies the Jed, as his body is the temple which has been broken. In the Osiris myth, Osiris was killed by Set by being tricked into a coffin made to fit Osiris exactly. Set then had the coffin with the now deceased Osiris flung into the Nile. The coffin was carried by the Nile to the ocean, and on to the city of Byblos in Lebanon. It ran aground and a sacred tree took root, and rapidly grew around the coffin, enclosing the coffin within its trunk. The king of the land, intrigued by the tree's quick growth, ordered the tree cut down and installed as a pillar in his palace, unaware that the tree contained Osiris's body. Meanwhile, Isis searched for Osiris aided by Andreas, and came to know of Osiris's location in Byblos. Isis maneuvered herself into the favor of the king and queen and was granted a boon. She asked for the pillar in the palace hall, and upon being granted it, extracted the coffin from the pillar. She then consecrated the pillar, anointing it with myrrh and wrapping it in linen. This pillar came to be known as the Pillar of Jed. The tree is probably associated with the Sumerian god of male fertility, Enki, and for both Osiris and Enki, an erect pole or pole-like symbol stands beneath a celestial symbol. Additionally, the sacred tree and the Assyrian winged disc, which are generally depicted separately, are combined in certain designs, similar to the Jed pillar, which is sometimes surmounted with a solar disc. There is tempting evidence of a strong link between the Jed column and the concept of Kundalini in yoga. Consider Vietnam and the Israeli-Gaza conflict in the 60s, and the rebel alliance, the Empire, and Zionism all start to weave together in a curious way. The trilogy of prequels starred Israeli-born actress Natalie Portman as the secret wife of Anakin Skywalker, and Luke and Leia's mother, Queen Amidala. You don't have to be a linguist to figure out that the Jedi Knights, who use the Force, the spiritual power of good deeds, Aka the Mitzvah, to do good in their battle with the dark side, the Yetzer Hara, or the evil urge within us all, bear the anglicized name of a Jew. In other words, Jedi equals Yehudi equals Jew, and the name of the wise old man Yoda, who passed away at the very biblical age of 900, translates as one who knows in Hebrew. None of this was lost on filmmaker Mel Brooks, whose 1987 Star Wars parody Spaceballs relied on Brooks's usual Yiddish shtick humor, including the catchphrase, "May the Schwartz be with you." Darth Vader's Jewish origin. The Golem of Star Wars, 6937. Kadar. Definition: to be dark. The design and concept of Darth Vader is partially based on Jewish myths and traditions. Many of Star Wars fans are already aware of the 3 lines of Hebrew letters that appear on the character's chest plate. It's been surmised to be upside-down Hebrew that translates as "one shall be regarded innocent until he is proven guilty." But let's check it out a little deeper. The first line has 5 letters into words, apparently meaningless, unless, with a bit of stretching it, we read it as, "The third may be read as till his cast down, until she left." Someone suggested as a translation, which is interesting considering Padme's storyline. But the second line is the interesting one, written upside down. It's more like a label than a part of a sentence. And the letters are the words golem and sits. The word golem appeared only once in the Old Testament, but is a big subject in Jewish folklore and myths. Some people believe that special rabbis have the ability to create life, as a crude imitation of God's power. The created creature typically is from mud or sewage. The ritual of creation is difficult and magical. The result is a mindless servant. Its mission is to serve and protect the chosen people, especially his rabbi. According to folklore and tradition, Hebrew letters were written on the golem to give him life. Then by removing one of them he was deactivated. The golem was a very popular myth in the Jewish community of Prague, and the Jewish town there has a big statue of the golem that looks just like Darth Vader. Anecdotally, artist Ladislav Solon designed two statues there. One resembles the Rabbi Law of Prague, and the other to represent the legend of the ghost of Iron Knight. But Law is famous for making a golem according to Jewish myth, so people assume that the knight statue is the golem. The obscurity of the legend of the Iron Knight helped the confusion. The golem, in some versions of the story, became too dangerous, like a Frankenstein monster, so the rabbi had to deactivate it, especially when the creature turned against its master and became difficult to control. The creature was usually deactivated during the rest day. The activation letters were written on the creature's forehead, or on a paper that was put inside its mouth. The second Hebrew word is sits, which is the name of the golden plate on the turban, head of the Jewish high priest, as part of his official garments. The breastplate on Darth Vader's suit may be a control panel similar to the golem's activation letters divided by. The design of the chest plate itself, with its iconic red and blue buttons that look very similar to the design of the high priest's breastplate, as described in Exodus 39. And he made the breastplate of cunning work, like the work of the ephod, of gold, blue, and purple, and scarlet, and fine twined linen. It was foursquare. They made the breastplate double. A span was the length thereof, and a span the breadth thereof, being doubled. And they set in it 4 rows of stones. The first row was a sardius, a topaz, and a carbuncle. This was the first row. And the second row, an emerald, a sapphire, and a diamond. And the third row, a ligure, an agate, and an amethyst. And the fourth row, a beryl, an onyx, and a jasper. They were enclosed in ouches of gold in their enclosings. And the stones were according to the names of the children of Israel, 12, according to their names, like the engravings of a signet, every one with his name, according to the 12 tribes. And they made upon the breastplate chains at the ends, of wreathen work of pure gold. And they made to ouches of gold, and to gold rings, and put the 2 rings in the 2 ends of the breastplate. And they made the plate of the holy crown of pure gold, and wrote upon it a writing, like to the engravings of a signet, holiness to the Lord. Solomon is admired with his diligence in building the temple. But according to Freemasons and many historians, Hiram Abiff was the chief architect employed by King Solomon to build his temple in Jerusalem. The tale of Hiram Abiff as passed down in Masonic lodges underpins the 3rd degree. According to legend, as the work comes to completion, 3 fellow craft masons from the workforce ambush him as he leaves the building, demanding the secrets of a master mason. Hiram is challenged by each in turn, and, at each refusal to divulge the information, his assailant strikes him with a mason's tool. He is injured by the first 2 assailants, and struck dead by the last. These ruffians bury his body under a sprig of acacia. The next morning, the master mason's absence is immediately noticed. King Solomon sends out other masons to look for him, who later discovers the spring, and exhume his body to be given a decent burial. Solomon informs his workforce that the secret word of a master mason is now lost. He replaces it with a substitute word. This word is considered a secret by masons, but for hundreds of years various revelations of the word have been made, usually all differing from each other. One such revelation is Machbenic, or decay apparently based on gestures given, and words spoken upon the discovery of Hiram's body. Such is the general legend as related in the Anglo-American jurisdictions. In continental Freemasonry, the secrets are not considered lost but esoteric, but Solomon orders them buried under the temple, inscribed on Hiram's grave, and the same substitution is made as a mark of respect. The secrets lost in the other tradition are here given to new master masons as part of their ritual. In this version, Hiram is often renamed Adoniram. In his book The Sufis, the Afghan scholar Idris Shah suggested that Dulnun al-Mishri might have been the origin of the character Hiram Abith. In the Masonic Master Mason ritual, the link, he believes, was through the Sufi sect Al-Banna who built the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. This fraternity could have influenced some early Masonic guilds which borrowed heavily from the Oriental architecture in the creation of the Gothic style. According to Islam and Judaism, Solomon turned towards worldly pleasures which caused him the sad end. Instead of following God and his commandments, Solomon surrounded himself with luxury and women. In fact, it is said Solomon had around 700 wives and 300 concubines. Moreover, those women were from those nations about which God warned Israelites that they can turn their hearts after their God, and they must not marry with them. Judaism, particularly, is a tad more strict in explaining the sad ending of Solomon. It states that Solomon thought the biblical prohibition does not apply to him. This perception turned him into a commoner, especially Torah placed limits on the number of wives and wealth, which he broke, and as a result, his son Rehoboam faced a divided kingdom. In Islam, King Solomon is a prophet. Islam doesn't associate him with sad ending or death, and doesn't raise questions on his marriages as well. In fact, Islam is the only religion that elevates the status of Solomon, and explains almost all aspects of his life positively. It refuses the claim that Solomon turned to idolatry. Islamic version about Solomon tells that one of his enslaved jinn posed as Solomon and ruled his kingdom as well for a limited time. In other words, it's not the Solomon who disbelieved, it was the devils who disbelieved. The French Masonic historian Paul Naudin has highlighted the similarity between the death of Hiram and the murder of Renaud de Montalban in the late 12th century Chanson Digest, the four sons of Aymon. Renaud, like his prototype Saint Reinald, was killed by a hammer blow to the head while working as a mason at Cologne Cathedral, and his body hidden by his murderers before being miraculously rediscovered. The plot of the French chanson is as follows. Renaud and his three brothers were sons of Aymon de Dordogne. They flee from the court of Charlemagne after Renaud kills one of Charlemagne's nephews in a brawl. A long war follows, during which Renaud and his brothers remain faithful to the chivalrous code of honor despite their sufferings, until Charlemagne is prevailed on by his paladins to make terms. The four brothers are pardoned on condition that Renaud go to the Holy Land on crusade, and that their magical horse Bayard, who could expand his size to carry all four brothers on its back, be surrendered to Charlemagne. Charlemagne orders that the magic horse be drowned by chaining it to a stone and throwing it in a river, but the horse escapes and lives forevermore in the woods. Renaud, after further adventures on the Crusades, returns home. He eventually abandons his home and goes to Cologne, where he becomes a builder on a shrine to Saint Peter. In the end, he is murdered by resentful workers, but his body is miraculously saved from the river and makes its way magically in a cart back to his brothers. Bulfinch relates that the cart magically moved to Dortmund, where Renaud is made patron saint of a new church, identifying him with Saint Reinald. Charlemagne is portrayed as vengeful and treacherous in these stories, and he is fooled by the sorcerer Maugris. The sympathy of the storyteller is clearly with the four brothers, but ultimately feudal authority is upheld. According to Timothy Hogan, it has been the subject of many Masonic historians and authors over the centuries to seek the origins of elements of Masonic ritual, and to look to the myths, symbols, and ritual practices of cultures and societies of past ages in an attempt to understand how the rituals of Freemasonry came to be. These efforts of speculative Freemasons have usually traced some kind of initiatic origin to the rites and practices of ancient Egyptians, or the philosophical and religious ideas of ancient India and China, and then tracing these ideas through Grecian, Elysian, Roman, and sometimes Druidic channels, and comparing them to biblical narratives from the Torah and New Testament, with further exploration into Kabbalistic, Gnostic, and alchemical ideas that influenced groups like the Knights Templar of Europe. One need only explore the works of Pike or Mackey to see this winding exploration through history. In the 20th century, a new form of creating mythological stories came into being with the film industry. By projecting light onto a wall, Stories could be told and experienced by the viewers in a manner similar to a drama or play, and consequently movies were made. Like the Shakespeare plays of ages past, many modern movies contain ideas and symbolism from past myths of different cultures, which are just retold in new forms. It should not be surprising in this light, then, to understand that many of the elements in these ancient myths were also incorporated into Freemasonic ritual in ages past, and that certain themes and symbols that are in Freemasonry were likewise incorporated into modern films. Among modern films that contain a number of ideas and themes that can also be found in Freemasonry are those of the Star Wars franchise. In this article, I will attempt to show the origin of some symbols and themes found in the Star Wars movies, and then show how these same symbols and themes can likewise be found in Freemasonry. I will not retell the entire Star Wars plot, and it falls upon the readers to watch the Star Wars films for themselves, in order to understand the context of the ideas I will be exploring. Likewise, as a warning to those who haven't watched the Star Wars films, this article can give away spoilers to the plot of Star Wars. Central to the Star Wars story is the idea that there is a binding consciousness energy field that surrounds and penetrates all things, called the Force. The origins of many of the quotes from the Star Wars movie in which the Force is described can be found in works like the Tao Te Ching, and in fact, the Force is in line with what has been called the Tao Ether, and the all and other philosophical systems of ages past. This energy has had various attributes in many cultures of ages past, which can be found under names like Nous, Ki or Kai, Audic Force, Vril, Yin and Yang, and other names. Some have looked to Albert Pike's ideas about Force and his morals and dogma as another way of describing this energy. I will not provide Pike quotes about the Force in this article, but I would encourage anybody to read Morals and Dogma, in which Pike's ideas about Force are elaborated on. Likewise, central to the theme of Star Wars are the characters who seek to understand and utilize this Force, and who go by the name of Jedi. The Jedi Knight is a warrior monk who utilizes and tries to maintain order by being in harmony with the Force. The Jedi seeks to balance the physical and spiritual energies in a manner similar to the symbolism behind the square and compasses in Freemasonry. The idea of the Jedi Knight comes from the Knights Templar, who were in fact both monks and warriors. The Templar theme runs throughout Star Wars, and Templars are featured in the higher degrees of all rites of Freemasonry. The ideas behind warriors who followed a spiritual code can be found going back to all ages in history, but certainly the Templars were the most recent expression of them, and many Masonic historians trace the origin of modern Freemasonry to different Templar strains that survived their persecution by the Roman Church in 1307. One of the origins of the European model of spiritual chivalry can be found in the myths and legends of ancient Celtic traditions, and it is in these Celtic traditions that we likewise find the key to the myths that unlock the story that was utilized for the film Star Wars. In the ancient Celtic myths and traditions, the first chivalric tradition, which is similar to what is found in Star Wars, is the Red Branch of Ulster, also known as the Red Branch Knights, and which is believed to have historically been one of the models for King Arthur's Round Table Knights, and some say the Templars themselves. The Red Branch of Ulster is likely also the model for the Rebel fleet in Star Wars, also known as the Red Brigade, which Luke Skywalker becomes a part of. Understanding this basis, let us look at some further Celtic mythological elements that can be found in Star Wars, and then also compare similar elements in Freemasonry. In the film Star Wars, the main character of Luke Skywalker has his hand cut off by his father Darth Vader, and then his hand is replaced with a metal working hand. This is from Celtic myth of Muada. Muada was the first king of the Tuatha Dé Danann. He was also known as Ergetlam, meaning silver hand. In both stories, the new metal hand replaces the original, and helps aid them in their battles ahead, without revealing Masonic secrets. This cutting off of the hand is something that is likewise found in the penalties of Freemasonry, as particularly found in the York Rite. Muada was known for having a special flaming sword of light that he used to try and stop a lesser dark king named Brez, who works for an overlord king named Baylor. However, Muada was not successful in stopping Brez or Baylor, and so the job fell to one of his students named La, who likewise inherited Muada's flaming sword of light. This flaming sword of light is something that we also find in the story of the Garden of Eden, in the Torah, in which flaming swords of light guard Eden. Esoteric Masonic traditions of the past have associated this flaming sword with the word, and in some 18th degree rituals, for the Scottish Rite, this flaming sword is still used. In other quasi-Masonic systems like Martinism, it is during the first degree that the new initiate receives a sword of light which is emblematical of the word. In Freemasonry, the candidate of the first degree is received on a sharp implement, which in many lodges and in different cultures is actually in the form of a sword. So the candidate is received by the sword in a similar manner as Luke receives a sword at the start of his journey. For in Star Wars, Luke Skywalker begins his studies under Obi-Wan, and he receives a lightsaber. In many ways, Wada is the model for Obi-Wan, and La is the model for Luke, and Luke inherits a lightsaber from Obi-Wan in the same manner that La receives his flaming sword from Wada. The only difference here is that Luke gets his hand cut off by Vader instead of Obi-Wan. In the Celtic stories, Wada had his hand cut off by a dark king named Brez, who worked for the overlord evil king named Baelor. Baelor is known for having a death-dealing fire eye, which causes destruction when it opens, to include causing craters in the earth. The Dark King Brez was known as being of the evil eye because he worked for Baelor, who had the eye of destruction. Baelor is in fact the model for Vader in the Star Wars films, and his fire eye is the model for the Death Star that is found in Star Wars, which looks like a giant eye that opens and causes fiery destruction. King Baelor is said to receive his name from Beleros, meaning the Deadly One, and he is also called Baelor Beardjerk, meaning Baelor of the Piercing Eye, and he is said to be from a race of giants known as the Fomorians. Just like in the Celtic myths, Vader uses his Death Star fire eye to destroy worlds, and it is the job of Luke Skywalker to stop him. In the Celtic Irish mythology, the character named La ends up slaying King Baelor by putting out his death-dealing fire eye, by flinging a rock through it. La then becomes king of the Tuatha Dé Danann. La was the grandson of Baelor. In like manner, Luke ends up stopping Vader by slinging a shot from his spaceship into the Death Star and destroying it, and it is revealed in Star Wars that Luke is Vader's son. Baelor supported another Fomorian king named Brez of the Evil Eye, who is the one who cut off Wada's hand. La served under Wada. Wada was killed and beheaded by Baelor, but La avenged him by killing Baelor. In similar manner, in the Star Wars films, Luke encounters a vision of Vader in the Cave of Yoda, and proceeds to cut off his head, after which an image of his own face is found on it. Luke's first test in becoming a Jedi involves him facing his fears in Yoda's cave, and the result is a vision of witnessing his own head cut off from fighting Vader. In like manner, the first degree of Freemasonry has multiple symbols in it alluding to a severed head, including the emphasis on John the Baptist. It should be mentioned that this Irish Celtic story of La slaying the giant Baelor by taking out his death-dealing fire eye is not the only story in mythology in which the evil antagonist is taken out by hitting him in the eye in similar manner, how Vader's Death Star is taken out. Into later Celtic tales, the heroes Cuchulainn and Finn defeat the one-eyed giant named Gaul. Likewise, Odysseus speared the giant Cyclops through his single eye. Finally, King David slayed the giant Goliath with a single shot from his slingshot to the giant's forehead. And some esotericists have seen in this the suggestion that Goliath was taken out by destroying his third eye on the brow of the forehead, also known as the Nazar in Aramaic, from which Nazorian is derived. From a Masonic perspective, do we not see resonance with Hiram likewise being killed with a blow to his forehead? It could be argued that the Death Star represents the all-seeing eye of the dark side of the Force, which needs to be taken out in order for light to not be overtaken by the darkness. The Death Star was deemed to be so large that it was compared to a moon, and certainly something of this size would actually block out the light of any nearby sun that a planet would need to sustain life. These are some of the mythological roots of the Star Wars films, but let's explore some of the symbolism of these films which can also be found in Freemasonry. I will allude to some meanings of things that I find significant, and readers are welcome to draw their own conclusions. First and foremost, it should be noted that the hero of Star Wars, Luke Skywalker, has a name that is not only similar to La of the Celtic myths, but the name Luke in Greek means light. From a Masonic perspective, this is central to the Masonic initiations. Luke's Celtic name of La is likewise somewhat similar in sound to the pronunciation name of Luke's twin sister Leia. Luke trains for a time under the Jedi Knight Ben Kenobi, also known as Obi-Wan. The name Ben means son in Hebrew, whereas his Abba or Obi means father. If we combine these two names of his, Ben and Obi in Hebrew, we can get Abn or Abin, which means stone in Hebrew. The teacher of both Obi-Wan and Luke is a Jedi master named Yoda, who, by his old age, is implied to be the foundation of the Jedi code and tradition. The name of Yoda is very similar to the Hebrew letter Yod, which in fact looks like Yoda's head. Yod is the foundational letter in Hebrew, and it represents a point, in which all of the other Hebrew letters are derived, in much the same manner that Yoda is the foundational Jedi in which Obi-Wan, Luke, and even Vader had all trained for a time. In Freemasonry, the Yod is prominent in many degrees, and can be found on the ring of the 14th degree in the Scottish Rite. In some Masonic jurisdictions, rites, and degrees, a Yod can be found in the square and compasses in place of the letter G that is found in the United States lodges. Finally, it should be noted that Darth Vader's original name was Anakin, which can be a composite word of the words Anna, or Anu, meaning God in Sumerian, and kin meaning progeny in English, which in this case suggests that Anakin was the progeny of the gods, and he fell in much the same manner as we find in the stories of Satan. Vader becomes the fallen one who embraces the dark side of the Force, while Luke, meaning light, fights Vader using the light side of the Force. In this light, we can also see a similar meaning alluded to in the word Yishin, in which Jah is one of the names for God in Hebrew, and kin can likewise mean progeny in English. As an aside, it could also be pointed out that Vader is a Sith Lord, and Sith in Hebrew is similar to Seth, in which S or Shin has a Kabbalistic meaning of fire, and Th or Teth means cross, and so Seth or Sith is a composite symbol of a cross on fire. Some interpret this as a cross of light, but in this case it could likewise mean the destruction of the cross. If we look to the Templars as the model of the Jedi, and who were known for having the red equilateral cross as their symbol, then certainly a Sith would use as their symbol the destruction of that cross, which is implied in the name Sith. Throughout the Star Wars saga, stories are told in which both the light and the dark sides of the Force exert themselves through different characters. We can find similar symbolism in Freemasonry, the black and white checkered pavement, in the center of which is found a star, traditional symbol for the ether, which in Star Wars is called the Force. So this struggle between light and dark culminates in the star in Freemasonry in the same manner as the light and dark aspects of the Force contrast each other in the plot of Star Wars.
Hey, everybody, tune in to Recent Targaryens.
Recent Targaryen. Recent Targaryen.